2. Olivia charged, swinging the bow toward her opponent's head, switching it to a low strike to his thigh when he lifted his hand to block. She followed the hit with a swift kick to the side of the knee, and he crumpled. By then, the other 8 were rushing at her, and she didn't have time or sight to spare for him or the ice pick. Spinning, she swung the bow around her, connecting here with a shoulder and there with a rib. One opponent got inside her guard, so she jabbed the heel of one hand at his face, hammering his nose with a sickening crunch, then tugged hard on his shirt to bring him down in front of 2 of his comrades, who lost their balance and fell in a jumble on top of him. Pivoting, she found that the other 5 had shifted behind her. 2 pairs separated and stood back, silent. The 5th man, the largest of the whole group, stood assessing her. Olivia's heart hammered in her chest, but her hands holding the bow were steady. A second later, the large man came at her. Olivia aimed her blows at his head, but he didn't try to block. Instead, after she beat a staccato rhythm on his skull, he shook the assault off as if her bow were only a noisome fly. A wide grin split his face. Crap. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the 4 men she'd brought down struggle upright. Double crap. The large man lowered his head. He lowered his head and shoved toward her. Olivia tossed her bow up, grabbed the back of his shirt as she stepped out of his path, and flung him toward the ground. His momentum, aided by his weight, sent him crashing. She caught the bow and turned, jabbing at the base of his neck as she did. After that, the melee turned into a flurry of strikes, feints, and kicks. Olivia countered everything they brought at her, surprised at how uncoordinated and ineffectual they were. Very few of their blows had landed, and the ones that had lacked strength. They fought like a bunch of sloppy bar drunks, telegraphing roundhouse swings and headbutts. Though she hadn't yet tired, her bodysuit clung to her sweaty skin, and she'd begun to breathe heavily. She just sent a front kick into an opponent's lower groin, bending him over with a grunt, when she caught the sly smile another 2 shared. The truth settled in a sickening pool in the pit of her stomach. They were playing with her, like a pack of wolves nipping at the flanks and heels of a bull moose. Any moment now, when they judged she'd worn herself out or grown overconfident, they'd pile on her. Good thing she was smarter than an average bull moose. It was time to take off the kid gloves. This time, she aimed her blows to kill instead of incapacitate. Not an easy maneuver with a bow, but not impossible, especially if the one wielding the staff committed to the kill. When she cracked a weighted tip against her attacker's head, she aimed for his temple, swerving to whip the other end across the windpipe of the attacker behind her, before the first had dropped to the ground. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Though the park lights illuminated the area in which they fought, the thick, dark trees beyond the monument absorbed the light. To Olivia's heightened senses, the silent blackness beyond thrummed with menace. She scanned the path, but nothing moved except the eyes and heaving chests of the 7 men facing her. Olivia had no idea why half of them were still standing. One attacker's nose was smashed and his features obscured by blood. Another's knee had been crushed so badly that he hopped on his good leg like a sparrow. Another carried an injured arm close to his chest. All had visible bruises and welts. The odd, sulphurous scent had grown stronger and held a taint of rotting meat. She inhaled, making her eyes water. Blinking, she heard Melissa moan. The low sound broke the spell. In the next instant, 3 attackers ran at her, and it was all she could do to keep from going down on the ground, a place she definitely didn't want to be. One man got under her guard and punched her exposed ribs. Crying out, Olivia held on to his extended arm and pulled him closer and down to knee him in the gut. The sharp pain in her side as she did took much of the strength out of the maneuver, but she had unbalanced him. Shoving him into the second attacker, she slashed the bow across the third attacker's eyes. Screaming, he staggered back, falling over the first 2 on the ground. Olivia shuffled backwards, her broken rib shooting pain through her whole torso. In the earlier scuffle, she'd glimpsed the ice pick lying not far from Melissa's prone form. She might need it with these inhuman jokers. She just brushed something with her toe when the remaining 4 attackers descended. Scooping it up without looking, she slammed the bow into the ground so that the extensible arms slid back into the base. As she rose, She swung the heavy metal baton into the first attacker's jaw, breaking it, before twisting to punch the ice pick at a second attacker. It wasn't enough. Neither injured man went down, or even seemed to notice that she'd struck him. She had just enough time and presence of mind to notice their glittering, dead gazes. A heartbeat later, they'd both broken through her guard. One grabbed the wrist of the hand holding the ice pick, while he punched at her face, snapping her head back. His partner chopped at her other wrist, causing her to drop the baton. The second pair drove in behind them, landing a punch and a kick at her thigh. The stench swirling around the four men gagged her, and her knees weakened as her vision splintered into brilliant shards. Her sensei would not be pleased. Then again, he'd never taught her to fight off a horde of zombies. Olivia let her body sag, dragging the attacker still holding her wrist down to the ground with her. His body tumbled, absorbing several blows from his comrades as he fell. Pinned beneath his grunting form, Olivia searched with her free hand for her dropped baton. She wanted to crush one final skull before they killed her and Melissa. On such a beautiful July night in the City of Music, where even the motion of the stars against the heavens suggested a waltz, the Drangùe should have been discussing opera with the vivacious woman whom he had escorted along the promenade beside the Weinfluss River after dessert at the Stadtpark restaurant. He should have been debating Mozart and Verdi, all while listening to the steady beating of her heart beneath her clear, mellifluous voice. Instead, he found himself sprinting down a darkened path toward the sounds of a brutal beating. Given the summer break in Vienna's concert season, the performance at the Vienna Salon had been only mediocre, but even a third-string Viennese orchestra plays heartbreakingly well, and he had not been to a concert in some time. His date had been far from mediocre. She had been lovely, smart, and knowledgeable about music and opera, yet with an enchanting innocence that made him feel protective in a way that he had not felt in a lifetime. He wondered if he had hurt her with his abrupt departure, his insistence that he would call her tomorrow. The furrows on her forehead as she stood on the sidewalk where he had left her waiting for a taxi made him think that she doubted him. Shaking his head and letting a soft expletive leave his lips, he ignored the sharp pain behind his breastbone at the thought. It was what it was. He could not change his duty or his destiny. It had indeed been a lifetime since he had learned that adamantine lesson. He was his father's son. He was a Drangùe. Despite knowing his duty, and despite his long years of fulfilling it, nothing had ever prepared him for the sight that met his eyes as he approached the well-lit Schubert statue on the other side of the Weinfluss. A lithe figure in white stood amongst an encircling group of battered and disheveled men, each of whom sported multiple bruises and bleeding cuts. Though the woman, he could tell little more about her thanks to the close-fitting head covering that she wore, stood motionless. The Drangùe's long experience fighting hand-to-hand read deadly alertness in her posture. She held a curious weapon, a long black staff with weighted ends, in a trained ready stance, and though her white tank was already dark with sweat, she looked strong and capable of fighting for as long as necessary. He stopped outside the illuminated circle to evaluate the situation. Maybe his aid wasn't needed. A low moan came from a young woman lying near the base of the Schubert statue. The Drangùe's heart twisted, but before he could act, he sensed rather than saw the attack on the figure in white. As she pivoted to strike at one of the three men who lunged, another charged, his fist striking her exposed ribs. The figure in white cried out. It was not a loud cry, but its sharpness, combined with the thud of knuckle on bone, told the Drangùe that her attacker had broken at least one of her ribs. A white-hot fury lit him. The Drangùe inhaled, his breath scorching his throat and nostrils, but he never lost focus. He waited a moment longer to assess the remaining four men who stood, silent and intent, watching their companions attack the figure in white. They needed to be dealt with first. The Drangùe saw the figure in white grab the assailant who had punched her, knee him, and then shove him into a second attacker before whipping her staff across the third man's eyes. The man screamed, staggered over his two partners, and fell. The woman limped back from the other four men, only dropping her gaze for a moment as she reached for something on the ground. That was enough for them to launch themselves at her. The figure in white rose up to meet them with something that flashed in the light in one hand, and her staff, now transformed into a baton in the other. The Drangùe heard bone crack as she hammered the baton into an attacker's jaw. Her second hand sliced at another attacker, and the Drangùe saw blood pour from an eye socket. Even as he cheered mentally at her incredible skill and heart, warning bells sounded in the back of his mind. They should have dropped like dead weights. Instead, they kept coming. The one-eyed man grabbed a wrist and hit her in the face, while the slack-jawed villain struck the baton from her other hand. The Drangùe saw the blows that came after that, the kick and the punch, the figure in white pulling an attacker down, the eager swings of arms and feet. But these details blurred in his awareness as he sprang from the darkness into battle. The men proved to be little more than fleshy, jointed sacks, less satisfying to hit than his punching bag. He clamped onto the nearest attacker's shoulder, pulling him close as his other hand slipped around to the man's chin, and he twisted hard. Flinging the dead man aside, the Drangùe grabbed another. This one fought, pushing his soft, flabby belly against the Drangùe as his fists flailed. His pants and grunts filled the Drangùe's ears. Behind them, a third attacker rose. By now, the Drangùe's battle senses had awakened, and he saw the man's thermal outline and heard his racing heart a fraction of a second before the blow. Roaring, the Drangùe spun, blocking the downward slash of the third attacker's hand with the second's back. The man screamed from the simultaneous stab and the scorching heat of the Drangùe's grip. The Drangùe locked gazes with the third man as he dropped the second to the ground. What he saw there knocked his fury back a little. The man's eyes glittered, emotionless and staring. A moment later, the Drangùe punched the man so hard his head snapped back, and he dropped to the ground in a boneless heap. Then the Drangùe swiveled to grab the last man off the figure in white. He was too late. The figure in white held her baton under the man's chin, her legs wrapped around his torso and squeezing as she tugged hard against his windpipe. It was only a matter of seconds before she had finished him. The Drangùe bent down and shoved the body away before pressing a hot fingertip against the man's neck to make sure there was no pulse. The figure in white lay for a moment, chest heaving, her arms and legs sprawled in an attitude of utter weariness. He scanned her for any more injuries. Red welts and gathering bruises mottled her pale flesh, visible along her arms and upper back and shoulders. The right side of her outfit was ripped to reveal a thin, bloody line that grazed her ribs. As he reached to pull the fabric aside, to make sure that the wound was as shallow as it appeared, she flinched. "Who are you?" Her weak voice sounded more curious than frightened. His sensitive hearing caught traces of a foreign accent in her German. "American? Let me see how deep that is," he ordered, ignoring the question. The huskiness of his voice surprised him. "No huskier than usual," he assured himself. "Exhaling hot, smoky air tends to do that." "It's just a scratch." She coughed and winced. "Damn bastard tried to stab me with an ice pick. If I hadn't rolled when I did, he would have, too." The Drangùe willed his fingers to cool to something closer to normal human temperature before stroking her upper arm. She'd looked so invincible and deadly only moments before, but now that he knelt next to her, he could see how fragile and delicate she really was. Despite having the muscular physique of a dancer or gymnast, she could not weigh more than 125 pounds or stand taller than 5'6". In other words, half his weight and more than a head shorter. He felt his ire rise. "Let me see it." This time he growled. She went still, and he regretted his words. Gritting his teeth, he slid a fingertip along the wound. She shivered under his touch, and for a moment, he forgot that he only wanted to know whether she was hurt or not. He had the urge to slip his whole hand, palm flattened, across her abdomen, to feel the banded muscle there. He resisted. "Told you," she whispered, and he removed his finger. He looked up then, wanting to see her eyes. That was when he got a good look at the head covering she wore. It was a black and white Harlequin mask, but nothing like the elaborate ones he had seen in Venice for Carnival. Instead of a hard, painted shell, white fabric stretched over her entire head and most of her neck, detailing the structure of her face and neck while obscuring her features. The mask's own features had a clean, almost alien cast with large black eyes, a single quirky eyebrow, an extravagant tear on one cheek, and firmly closed lips. This, then, was a mime whose expression never changed.
At least one of your ribs is broken.
It was not a question. She laughed this time, but the laugh choked off on a sob.
Nothing worse than I felt before,
she said when she got her breath back.
But one of them hit me pretty hard.
You're all blurry, and it looks like you have glowing wings. Shocked that she had seen more than a shimmering nimbus from his harmonic vibrations, the Drangùe forced himself to stay calm. It would do no good whatever to burn her when he touched her. To distract himself, he gazed around the area, aware all at once that he had been so focused on the Harlequin that he had let his battle senses go dormant. That was when he felt the other presence lurking in the deepest shadows behind the Schubert statue. Someone watched. Quickly, he looked at the scattered bodies. One or two breathed yet, but otherwise gave no sign of impending threat. The young woman he'd seen earlier now slouched against the base of the statue, her head drooping into a hand, and the other hand on her stomach. She began retching, twisted, and threw up. She was a good 10 meters away from him, and closer to the watcher. The Drangùe's unease increased. He lowered his voice as he leaned over the Harlequin, to use both hands to examine her shapely legs.
We are not alone.
She stilled again.
Where?
He admired her presence of mind, although after watching her fight, he expected nothing less. No doubt she had questions, but knew that now was not the time for them.
On the other side of the statue. My gut tells me that it is not a friend.
Who's throwing up?
The young woman that you were defending.
He finished his examination and sat back.
Do you think that you can walk? Your legs seem uninjured.
I'm fine. Help Melissa.
I will. After I help you.
He did not give the Harlequin a chance to protest. Instead, he grabbed her hand and hauled her to her feet. To anyone else, her slight intake of breath would have been imperceptible, but he heard it. He scowled.
Wait here.
A faint aura, perhaps a remnant of the Harlequin's thermal reading, remained as the Drangùe turned. Tucking this perplexing detail away to examine later, he sprinted to the young woman, who had finished throwing up and now gazed around wide-eyed. When he reached her, she looked up, her jaw slack. Bright red lipstick smeared her mouth, and mascara tracked down her cheeks. It was not a becoming face. At the sight of his radiant form, her mouth fell open.
Melissa?
She flinched.
How did you know my name?
In her rough voice, it was hard to distinguish the accent of her English. She swallowed and looked away.
What are you going to do to me?
He answered in English.
I am going to help you and your friend get medical care.
Confusion flitted over her features.
Friend? What friend?
The Drangùe looked back at the Harlequin, who stood upright and graceful in a relaxed stance, both arms loose at her sides. But she held the baton again in her left hand. That, and the alert tilt of her head as she appeared to scan the trees beyond him and Melissa, told him that, broken rib or not, she had recovered enough to defy anyone to attack her. He smiled to himself. Then he remembered Melissa's question.
A good Samaritan,
he said, his low voice pitched to reach the Harlequin's ears only. She swiveled her head to aim the painted eyes at him. Although her expression was hidden, he read her surprise at the intimacy of his voice in the subtle movement of her head. It occurred to him that it would be an intriguing challenge to decipher her responses without the usual facial cues.
Same as you,
she murmured. He wondered if she knew that he could hear her. At her words, something like a premonition coursed through the Drangùe. Frowning, he kept his gaze on the Harlequin as he spoke to Melissa, who stood blinking in the light from the nearby lamppost, which was much amplified by his presence.
You have had a great shock,
he said, pitching his voice to a soothing timbre.
And this is not a safe place. Let me escort you out of the park and take you to the hospital.
As he knew it would, his tone lulled her into a calmer, compliant state. Blinking several times, she stood and leaned toward him. He wrapped an arm around her waist while scanning the darkness beyond the statue. The air around them had grown oppressive to his senses, like pressure building before a storm. He urged the young woman to walk. Together, they headed up the path toward the Weißküstenstrasse entrance to the park, where he'd already arranged for his driver to meet them. The Harlequin waited until Melissa and he had passed, and then fell in behind them, walking backwards to watch their exit. Her heat radiated along the sensitive line of his spine, while the strong beating of her heart thundered in his ears. It took only a moment for him to realize that their hearts beat in unison, though he could not know whether that was a coincidence or through a fortuitous alignment. But as soon as he noticed, his own heart rate sped up. Hers followed suit. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled a little. As she caught herself, he felt her piercing gaze through her face covering. He forced himself to focus on Melissa, who'd started to sob. Pulling her closer, he raised his temperature slightly as he began to hum. She relaxed into his warmth, so much that he feared that he'd need to carry her. The Harlequin gave an exasperated sigh.
You are not sympathetic to Melissa's plight?
He made no effort to turn back to the Harlequin. Rather, he again pitched his voice to reach her ears. She snorted and turned to flank the wilting young woman. They had made it to the park entrance without being followed. The Drangùe saw with surprise that she now carried a messenger bag. How had she gotten that without him noticing?
"Who are you?"
asked the Harlequin in a husky whisper. This time when she asked, he knew that she wouldn't be ignored.
"Your accent. I can't place it. It's not German, that's for sure."
He sighed and moved his hand to Melissa's upper arm, putting some distance between them. It was necessary to wean her from his support by the time they made it to his waiting car and driver.
"A good Samaritan."
He paused.
"Same as you."
He wished then that he could see her expression as he echoed her earlier murmured words. Was she smiling or frowning? He himself frowned and increased his harmonics as well as the length of his stride.
"Why can't I see you?"
she asked.
"I thought it was because I'd gotten hit, but nothing else is hazy. Just you. In fact, if anything, I'd say you just got hazier."
Melissa stopped walking.
"You said you're taking me to the hospital."
From the rising petulance in her voice, he gathered that she was recovering from her earlier shock. She looked at the Harlequin, her eyes narrowing as she took in the painted face and torn white suit for the first time.
"Who the hell are you?"
The Drangùe's patience stretched thin. If he were honest, it was something more than annoyance that he felt right now. He ignored the young woman and answered the Harlequin.
"One of the mysteries of the universe, I am afraid."
He waved toward the street, where a black Mercedes waited at the curb.
"Now, here is my driver."
He turned to the patiently waiting man.
"These women need to be driven to St. Elizabeth's. You have the direction?"
The driver, who had gotten out of the car as they approached, inclined his head and opened the rear door.
"Please, ladies,"
he said, as he gestured for them to slide into the seat. The Harlequin was having none of it. She grabbed Melissa, who squealed at the same moment as her weighted staff appeared in her other hand with a snick. The Drangùe was impressed. Not only had he not anticipated such an act, but she'd executed both moves gracefully, even though she was injured.
"Yes?"
he asked, low and soft, no hint of smoky heat in his voice. From the corner of his eye, he saw the surprise on his driver's face. No doubt that loyal, opinionated servant would express his astonishment at great length later when they were alone.
"We're not getting into that car. I still can't see you."
Strong emotion strained her low voice.
"Whatever technology you're using to obscure your features leads me to conclude that you're not the Good Samaritan you'd have me believe. In fact, now that I think about it, it was too convenient for you to show up when you did. Am I right, Asmodeus?"
The Drangùe jerked and gave an involuntary hiss. His driver took a step toward them, his hand out, but the Drangùe hardly registered the shocked concern on his driver's face. The Harlequin's spine straightened a fraction.
"You know that name?"
It wasn't a question. Before he could answer or ask his own questions, Melissa, long ignored, acted. She elbowed the Harlequin in her broken rib and twisted free as the Harlequin doubled over with a sharp gasp. The Drangùe reacted without thinking, leaping to the injured woman's side as Melissa darted down the sidewalk, only to be stopped by his driver. The Harlequin dropped her staff, swayed, and then crumpled. He caught her before she hit the pavement. The heat and pain radiating from her hurt side shot through him like a thunderbolt, and his heartbeat sped up. Grimacing, the Drangùe compelled his heart to calm, feeling her breath stutter and then match his. She wriggled weakly. "Shh," he urged, drawing her closer to his chest and wrapping his arms around her shoulders. Crooning wordlessly, he stroked a warm palm along her injured side, willing the broken bone to knit. An urge to remove her mask and see her face took him, and he pulled back slightly. He had grabbed the edge of the covering and begun to slide it up her graceful neck, his gaze drawn to the erratic pulse at its base, when a Polizei car pulled in behind the Mercedes, its lights flashing. 2 officers jumped from the car, calling out to them to remain where they were. Melissa started screaming and struggling, breaking free from his driver's grasp as one of the officers came up, her hand on her holster. At the same moment, the Harlequin, who had sagged against him, surged forward, knocking him off balance as she drove the base of one palm under his chin. He released her in response. By the time he had recovered, she had turned away, snatched up her staff and the messenger bag, and begun sprinting in the river's direction. The second Polizei officer, who had reached the spot where the Drangùe stood, raised his pistol and shouted at her to stop. She kept running. As the officer squeezed the trigger, the Drangùe knocked his wrist up and away. The Harlequin ran through the intersection across from the Hilton Vienna, dodging cars. She never looked back. They lost sight of her on the dark sidewalk beyond the hotel. Exasperated, the Drangùe turned to the second Polizei officer, who reached to restrain him. He stilled the harmonics and the light emanating from him, while slipping into the easy smile he had perfected over the years to diffuse tension. All the Polizei officers would see and remember was a tall, dark-haired man in evening wear that was a little disarrayed from brawling. It would take only a few moments of special charm to send them on their way to St. Elizabeth's with the young woman. "Officer," he said in German, infusing the words with warmth and connection. The man stilled and stood blinking. "I am so glad that you have arrived at the most opportune moment possible. This young lady—" He waved toward Melissa, who now stood gesticulating and chattering while the female Polizei officer and his driver listened. "Was beset upon in the park by a gang of thugs when I happened upon them. I am afraid that she needs medical attention." "Was that one of the thugs you were detaining?" the man asked, lifting his chin in the direction that the Harlequin had disappeared. "Why did you ruin my shot?" The Drangùe kept his gaze trained on the other man. "Who?" he asked, his feigned innocence underscored by his will. "Do you not think that you should call for reinforcements and investigate? They cornered her near the Schubert statue." After that, everything proceeded as the Drangùe knew it would. An ambulance arrived, and the female officer escorted Melissa to St. Elizabeth's. 3 more Polizei cars screeched to a halt at the curb, their lights flashing, and the officers emerged, running to the park entrance while the first male officer continued to take statements from the Drangùe and his driver. Although his driver lacked his boss's special abilities, he had the right temperament and experience to confirm that only the Drangùe and the traumatized Melissa had emerged from the Stadtpark. Later, the Drangùe would visit her in the hospital to ensure that she suffered no long-lasting damage from the incident, and to ask his own questions about the men and the Harlequin. Unfortunately, he would not be able to investigate the crime scene until after the Vienna Polizei had already processed it, but they did not have the same ability to analyze it as he did. Likely, there would be something they had overlooked that would tell him more. If, as he suspected, the attackers were no ordinary human gang, the Drangùe expected to find plenty of evidence that the Polizei had neither the ability to find nor the power to handle. After all, the Harlequin had mentioned Asmodeus. Asmodeus stood on the outskirts of the police investigation at the Stadtpark among a knot of officials. Although he had no official capacity here, he had delighted in using one of his avatars to insert himself into the situation. Of course, he could always compel people to share what they knew with him, but he much preferred the more subtle and satisfying manipulation of humanity. He chortled to himself, startling the nearest Polizei officer, who looked up from where he knelt by a body on the ground. An uneasy and subconscious recognition of Asmodeus's true nature crossed the officer's face, to be wiped clean as his own gullibility explained away what his gut knew. Asmodeus continued to smirk, knowing full well that it would torment the man's waking moments for weeks and his dreams for much longer. Yet the man would blame the carnage around them for recalling Asmodeus's unblinking stare and the unaccountable mirth that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, who would blame any of the Polizei for losing sleep over what they had discovered when they arrived in this stately and quiet park in the heart of Vienna? Apparently, the attackers had been a group of drug-addled soccer fans who'd continued to beat each other to a literal pulp after their intended victim and her heroic rescuer had escaped. Even the hardened Polizei detective with 20 years' experience had seen nothing like it. While 3 of the 9 men still lived, their conditions had been listed as critical, and they weren't expected to last through the night. None of them had any official identification on them. Early results from the National Fingerprint Database came up empty, and the fingerprints had been sent on to their counterparts at Interpol. None of the battered faces lent themselves to immediate identification, though the forensics experts remained hopeful that once they'd been cleaned prior to autopsy, that identifying features or marks would emerge. A forensic anthropologist would be brought in to reconstruct the faces if necessary, and there was always the chance that dental records would provide at least 1 or 2 identifications. Beneath the meticulous data collection ran a current of disgust and fear so strong that Asmodeus could taste its sweetness on his tongue. That alone merited his presence here, even if he learned nothing useful from these worthless investigators. As far as he could tell, they had no idea that the quote-unquote heroic passerby had withheld information about a certain figure in white wearing a head covering painted with a Harlequin's face. Then again, the hero was no ordinary man, was he? Asmodeus chortled again. He'd simply been looking for a little diversion when he realized that someone was tracking him online. Watching a woman dressed like a ridiculous fantasy superhero come to save the bait that he'd dangled had sent Asmodeus into orgiastic flights of anticipation. When she'd proved to be a tougher target than he could have anticipated, he'd been so transported by the blood and brutality that he'd felt a release such as he hadn't in decades. It seems that he had drawn a wild Eliud to his trail, and the spiritual power discharged from her death would feed him for some time. Even so, he'd felt sharp regret as the fight had drawn to a close, a fight she had been destined to lose no matter how preternaturally talented with a stick she had turned out to be. However, the regret had lasted only a moment as his minions overwhelmed her, bringing her to the ground like a wounded deer. He'd tasted her fear along with the metallic scent of blood. At that moment, ecstasy awaited him. That moment was stolen from him. The Drangùe, a powerful Eliud by the sheer white brilliance of his harmonics, had burst from the darkness with the power of a speeding comet. All at once, the sure victory had transformed into defeat. The Drangùe dispatched 3 of the attackers, leaving the Harlequin to subdue the 4th and final. Asmodeus, long used to disciplining the howling emotions that buffeted him, stifled his initial rage and anguish to move closer to observe their interaction. He'd given his presence away, though that unfortunate slip had yielded valuable information. He had baited his Harlequin, and she had in turn unwittingly baited one of his greatest enemies. As a result, Asmodeus had drunk in the sight of the Eliud kneeling by the injured woman, the Drangùe's protective urge and desire rolling from him in shockwaves. In doing so, the Drangùe had just revealed a major vulnerability. It was almost too delicious to bear. The question for Asmodeus now was how best to pursue the hero by using the Harlequin.